I spent 25 years of my life living within a few hundred yards of this building. Indeed, the last time I was here, it brings back horrific memories, was a children's tea party about 16 years ago when all kinds of unspeakable things happened, but it wasn't actually in the church. I think there's a church hall downstairs where it was. I remember the bouncy castle. I remember the accident on the bouncy castle. I remember the A&E. We don't have to go there. My kids were at Canonbury School, which is literally just a bit further along the road, and I lived just off the Holloway Road. Those were in the days, of course, when the country was well run and when you could actually drive around this borough. I mean, now I haven't lived here for a few years, and goodness knows what's happened. Chris Grayling must have taken personal charge of the transport system in Islington, given by what's happening at Highbury Corner. But I'm sure it will be a big improvement, and I hope it's going to open up the island in the middle. It's one of my great beefs, and it's a huge problem in Islington, is the lack of green space, and actually making better use of Highbury would be better. I love the introduction, one of the youngest members of the House of Lords. That is wonderful. The House of Lords, by the way, if it ever comes your way, is the elixir for perpetual youth. The average age of the House of Lords is 72. Average. So those of you who understand averages know what that means. When I became a member, which was in order to become Education Minister 15 years ago, so I was then 42. It's horrific to think back to those days. I was then the youngest member of the House of Lords. And when I was introduced in the strange garments that you wear, and I was an exotic creature being only 42, and I'd also been a certain amount of media stuff before. As I was being introduced and came into the chamber, which looks a bit like this, but just with lots of sort of Gothic decoration around too. Somebody muttered what they thought was sotto voce, but it ricocheted around the whole chamber. "My God, it's child labour," they said. That's 42 in the House of Lords. I'm now in my mid-50s, so I'm a juvenile. Another 10 years and I'll be, another 10 years I'm still not at average age, but I'm sort of advancing on it. But there is very good social science and medical research that shows that being a member of the House of Lords adds, on average, 15 years to your life expectancy because you get looked after so well. 305 quid a day, the only place in the country where they pay you to have lunch. You then get looked after extremely well. All of the doorkeepers are trained paramedics, so it's all great. And you could live on well into, most of them do go on well into their 90s and beyond. So I think at the moment, I'm only halfway through my allotted time span, provided the House of Lords isn't reformed, and I get thrown out and have to fend for myself as a member of the Liberal Metropolitan elite who has to live on life support. So, but it is great to be with you. And the thing that always comes through my mind when I go, because I've travelled, this is actually the only meeting I've done local to where I live since I've spent the last year campaigning on Brexit. I've done 152 public meetings, my office calculated 2 days ago. Of course, letting you into a secret, I love trains. So the further away from London, the better. There is a slight problem of Chris Grayling, because every train seems to be late, but I'm now a world expert on delay repay. I think I've probably made a profit out of the last year because of it all. And as I see all these things, the thought goes through my mind, indeed after 2 horrific experiences, it is clear to me that even in this extremity, there is one thing that the Prime Minister, Theresa May, could do that would unite the nation even now, and that is to sack Chris Grayling, because all of the transport systems are so utterly chaotic. And of course, the very fact that he is Transport Secretary sort of sums up the problem that we're in. He is probably the worst minister that this country has had since the Second World War. I mean, I'm open to other suggestions as to who is worse. But let's just go through it. He wrecked the probation service, literally one of the most important services in the country. He privatised it with no proper plan, wrecked it. There are hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have been made a misery as a result of Chris Grayling just from that one decision. He then as transport, do you remember the books? No books allowed in prisons? I cannot think of a more inhumane decision. I had to think of the most inhumane decision taken by a minister since the Second World War. I think forbidding prisoners from having books in prison that's certainly on the short list. I mean, I can't immediately think of the thing, apart from perhaps from universal credit, which goes higher on the list than that. Then transport, everything he has touched has turned to dust. Literally everything, including we had, first of all, the collapse of the East Coast rail line. That's £2 billion. We've had the total failure to refranchise most of the lines properly, each of which has cost a few £100 million. And then his pièce de résistance, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, was the ferry company with no ferries. Now, that was quite an achievement, that. And it wasn't only the ferry company with no ferries, for which he also had to pay £33 million of compensation to Eurotunnel, because he hadn't even thought to tell them that he might be setting up a competitive service, which, of course, is illegal under European procurement laws unless you do it properly. But then, even better, as if all that wasn't enough, it turned out that even had... Now, hold the thought for a moment. Even had the ferry company had some ferries, so it was actually possible for the ferry company with no ferries to procure some ferries so there could be some ferries, they were coming into the port of Ramsgate that hadn't been dredged. So the ferries wouldn't even have been able to get into port. Now, I know that the port of Ramsgate isn't dredged because I was the transport minister when the ferries stopped running into the port of Ramsgate. And part of the reason we stopped them running in, because they did ask for a big subsidy then, and Ramsgate is in a deplorable state. It needs all the business it can get, was because of the big investment that would have needed to have been made in dredging the port of Ramsgate. So what we would have had to have had, if the ferry company which had no ferries had some ferries and been able to operate the ferries, is they would have had to have docked about half a mile outside the port of Ramsgate with presumably rowing boats that would then have taken people into port. And this is the guy who is responsible for the transport systems of the country and is one of Theresa May's lead lieutenants. There was a glimmer of hope last week. Did you spot when the Prime Minister said she was going to start talking to the Labour Party, which, by the way, she should have started doing 2.5 years ago? I mean, she had no, or certainly a year and a half ago when she lost the election and had no majority. You know, if you've got no majority in the House of Commons and you have to get the most controversial political reform through since the war, what do? Do you A, speak to the opposition and try to reach an agreement with them, or do you B, vilify the opposition and have nothing whatsoever to do with them and then become surprised when the whole thing collapses? I mean, this isn't difficult, is it, as an option. But when the Prime Minister finally announced last week that she was going to start talking to the Labour Party, except that she hasn't really talked to them, because the Prime Minister is a ball of wool. Every time she moves, she unravels. So she didn't actually engage in these conversations. She said she was engaging in the conversations, but they didn't take place. And so Sir Keir Starmer, who, by the way, I think is doing a better and better job. I'm becoming a fan of Sir Keir Starmer. There are some, you know, you may think everything is gloomy, but there's some people who've been doing a brilliant job. Keir's been doing a brilliant job. Caroline Lucas, I think she's fantastic. I never thought I would say this because I'm a unionist. I believe that democratic unions are things you should stay in, just as I think it's a good idea that Islington is united with Westminster and Hackney and even Camden, so that we have this thing called London, which is quite a good idea. I also believe in the United Kingdom. I believe in the European Union. I want to keep on all of these unions. However, I am becoming quite a fan of Nicola Sturgeon's. She's quite good too. Because even though I don't like the idea of Scottish independence, and I will contest that next time, she is actually putting the interests of the country as a whole above her narrow short-term interests. And it's about time we had some more politicians who started doing that. So there are some glimmers of hope. Chris Grayling, I'm afraid, I cannot think of a single positive thing to say about him. I'm just thinking, if I think of one. Well, I may if I think long enough. By the end of this meeting, I'll have had one. However, the glimmer of hope last week is, did you notice that when the Prime Minister said that she was starting to talk to the Labour Party, Chris Grayling said he might resign. Parties were being thrown across the country. For this reason alone, her opening of discussions with the Labour Party was worthwhile. But he hasn't resigned. So even when he says the one thing, which is a red line beyond which he cannot go, would cause him to resign, he still doesn't resign. He cannot even competently resign. He is so incompetent, which does really take the biscuits. Because remember, almost everyone else has resigned from this government. Half of the ministers in this government have only been in office for less than a year. This government has had 41 resignations from it, 41 resignations in the course of 2 and a bit years. This government in which I served, Tony Blair's, which was in office for 10 years, had 6 resignations. 6. This gives you some idea of the state of the crisis we're in. 15% of the jobs in the government are unfilled at the moment because they resign so fast. She doesn't have time to fill the jobs. And in any case, she's running out because what the ERG, they're not prepared to come in. So Dominic Grieve, he's another hero, by the way. Dominic Grieve, round of applause for Dominic Grieve. He is fantastic too. And if you want to see a real horror show in action, go on Twitter and look at the Twitter illicit videoing of the meeting of the Beaconsfield Conservative Association, which has had a reverse takeover by UKIP. The guy who stood for UKIP against Dominic Grieve in the last general election has now joined the Beaconsfield Conservative Association with lots of his friends, and they were the ones masterminding this vote of no confidence. The Beaconsfield Conservative Association, which I think would have been for me, the definition of, apart from the House of Lords itself, the most genteel meeting of the English middle class it would be possible to devise. There were people yelling out at Dominic Grieve on this video as he read out from the government's white paper on the effects of no deal, the 6 weeks of medical supplies, the commandeering of all of the world's fridges, which Matt Hancock is currently doing, the 6 billion of direct costs and the 10 billion of indirect costs. He was reading these out, and people were yelling at him from the hall inside. Who are these people in? Traitor, liar, fuck off, and all of that. That's the Beaconsfield Conservative Association. I thought that sort of thing only happened in the Labour Party when Militant was taking over. But it's a sign of how desperate things have become that we're in this state. Now, where should we go? Where we should go is revoke Article 50, scrap Brexit, have a referendum, put this nightmare behind us. This is not a complicated situation we're in as a country. When you are committing a massive act of self-harm and you are literally bleeding as a result and the world around you is disintegrating, do you A, carry on, or B, stop? That is the situation which we face as a country. No one is forcing us to do this. We are not, ladies and gentlemen, in Dunkirk with the armies and the German panzers and all of that advancing, and we have got... This is all being done by us to us. That is what is happening. Our European friends and allies have behaved impeccably. Did you see the wonderful video of footage yesterday of Chancellor Merkel in Dublin? Chancellor Merkel saying in Dublin to the Prime Minister of Ireland, with lots of representatives of Northern Ireland there, why she, the Chancellor of Germany, it's not her country, was going to see that there wasn't a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Excuse me, the government of the United Kingdom should be saying we do not want a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and the Northern Ireland. I have huge admiration for Chancellor Merkel. She will go down as one of the greatest leaders of her country and of Europe. But at the moment, she's having to double. She's having to be Chancellor of Germany and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, doing the job that Theresa May should be doing. Now, I love the Germans, but I'm quite keen on the idea that we govern our own country because we can do so responsibly. And just in case you think that there is any limit to the irresponsibility of the Prime Minister, because I'm afraid at the moment she is just doing a deplorable job, we're in a desperate situation, it's deplorable, we are now at a situation where Parliament has voted by 423 votes to 203 against no deal, against having the 6 weeks of medical supplies, the Port of Dover coming to a halt, the M20 being the largest car park in Europe, all of the world's fridges being procured and all of that. Parliament has voted against that. The only way that we can avoid no deal and get into a safe haven as a result of this Brexit thing is now a long extension. There is no other way. Parliament has voted against the Prime Minister's deal three times, by majorities which are, the first time, the largest majority by which a government has been defeated in the House of Commons since the English Civil War. The second time it was rejected, the third largest defeat by a government since the English Civil War, and the last one by 58 votes, which is, by historic terms, a huge defeat for a government in the House of Commons. So the only way out of the catastrophe in which we are currently faced, unless the Prime Minister was going to go into no deal, which would be unthinkable, and it's a big bluff, and Prime Ministers should not play games of Russian roulette and bluff with the future of the country. But the only way of avoiding it is now a long extension. The House of Commons has voted for the long extension. The Prime Minister said to the House of Commons that she would apply for the long extension. And indeed, the argument which she used against the Yvette Cooper bill, which is the bill requiring the government to apply for long extension, which she said was an invasion of the royal prerogative because the hand of the government shouldn't be forced. The reason why that bill came forward is because people didn't trust the Prime Minister actually to apply for the long extension, which is the reason why I gave up my Thursday and a large part of my Friday fighting a filibuster in the House of Lords, because the government is trying to stop the bill and all of that. Now, the point about it, though, is I'm just doing my job. That's what people in Westminster are supposed to do, to see that the government of the country doesn't literally sabotage the country. I mean, it's not too much to expect that it does so. But when she was trying to argue that the Yvette Cooper and Oliver Letwin bill shouldn't proceed, she said it's because the government would itself apply for the long extension. So did you actually read the letter that Theresa May sent to the President of the European Council on Friday? It did not apply for the long extension. What she actually did was to write to Donald Tusk saying that she wanted an extension only until the 30th of June. Now, the point about the 30th of June is that does not leave, as she well knows, enough time to conduct a referendum, which is the only way out of the crisis which we now face. And it is a flagrant contradiction of the undertakings she herself gave to Parliament a week and a half ago. So do we, A, when I go back to Westminster tomorrow, need to get this Yvette Cooper bill through? Or B, do we trust Theresa May? Well, that is a total no-brainer. But just so you understand the depth of the crisis we're in and the brilliant role many of our European partners are playing, when I spoke to one of my friends, because I still have friends who are senior civil servants and who are, by the way, most of the civil service is aghast at what's happening. I've never known a policy in my lifetime which is where the civil service is so much at variance with the government. And because let's be clear, if you believe in good government, evidence-based policy, sound administration, not trashing the country, not spending £4.2 billion on literally destroying the country, then you probably don't believe in Brexit. Well, that includes almost all of the civil service. So there's virtually no civil servant I've met who, if asked, do you think this is a good idea, would say yes. That, by the way, is a pretty bad state of affairs. The only occasion in my lifetime I can remember when the civil service has been so at variance with a government is on the poll tax. Remember, that was Margaret Thatcher's last reform. But for the poll tax, there were, in fact, a few civil servants who believed in it. Amazingly, some of them actually thought that it might strengthen the bond between voters and their elected representatives because of these evil left-wing councils like Islington that were doing all kinds of Marxist things like having nurseries and things of this kind. But there were a few. There are none who believe in this. But the senior civil servant I spoke to, and I have to suspend you because we're in the world, we're in Alice in Wonderland now, you know, 6 impossible things before breakfast and all of that. When I phoned up this friend of mine, having read stupefied the Prime Minister's letter on Friday, it was so much worse than I thought. I just couldn't conceive that she would actually do something so utterly stupid. And said, look, what on earth is this? He said to me, don't worry, Andrew, she doesn't mean it. I said, what do you mean she doesn't mean it? She said, well, she's written asking for the 30th of June, but she knows that they will say no. You need to understand this is the way that the Prime Minister and the government is now operating. She knows that they will say no, and Merkel will say to her, you've got to have 9 to 12 months, because it's not possible to sort it out. In any case, we'll give that to you. And that's what she wants. So she can then say to Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson that I was forced by these Europeans to take 9 to 12 months to do it. What a shambolic way to run the country, where the only way, where Chancellor Merkel is essentially acting as a marriage guidance counsellor between Theresa May and Jacob Rees-Mogg. That is what is going on at the moment. I mean, it is utterly, utterly deplorable. And what is the right thing to do, therefore? The right thing to do, without a shadow of doubt, this is not one of those difficult decisions in politics or in life. It's not that there's quite a lot to be said for Brexit. There's some things to be said against it. There's this deal she's got, which is, you know, has got quite a lot to be said for it because we love the Northern Irish backstop as an exercise in the development of borders for the 22nd century. It could be a controlled experiment. I mean, there is nothing to be said for this at all. And the right thing to do, which is the reason we're all here on a Sunday afternoon in a state of some anxiety, is to stop it. We're a democracy, so what's the right way to stop it? It's to hold a referendum. What should the option be in the referendum? An option to stay in the European Union against whatever is the best deal that Theresa May and that lot can come up with. And what do I think will then happen? You just look at the polls, speak to people in the, you know, we may be the liberal metropolitan elite, but I can assure you in the pubs and in the schools and all of that, they're ordinary and very patriotic men and women who are trying to do their best for the country. It looks to me as if there will now be a decisive majority in favour of staying in the EU, now that we can actually see what the alternative is, and now that we can actually do what Jacob Rees-Mogg said in Parliament we should do 5 years ago. Do you remember when he was trying to persuade Cameron to go for the referendum? And he said what we should do, because he had to deal with the question, well, what will people be voting on? How will they know what the deal is? And he said what we should do is have a dual referendum. We should have a referendum on the principle of seeing what deal we can get from the European Union, and then we should have a referendum on the actual terms, because only when we see the terms do we know whether in fact it's a better deal than staying in the European Union. And do you know what? I think Jacob, for the only time in his life perhaps, was right. The right thing to do was and is to have the dual referendum. And this is not the betrayal of democracy, it is the completion of democracy. And it's very important we don't start using and giving any credence to the language of those people who are saying that somehow there's something undemocratic about asking the people what they think about the biggest issue that's a decision that's going to be taken in their political lifetime. We are a democracy. If there is a huge issue to be taken, if the situation has radically changed, if for the first time you can see what's at stake, do you, when you know there's massive public anxiety, you've got a petition of 6 million, and by the way, I'm told that more people in Islington North have now signed this petition than voted for my good friend Jeremy. That's fantastic. And I know how much Jeremy listens, so he'll be paying extremely close attention to this. Do you, A, consult the people and give them a say, or B, ride roughshod over them? This, again, is a total no-brainer. And the other reason why is we now know that 3 years ago in the referendum, we were told a whole pack of lies. Because remember, there were only 4 words on the ballot paper about what this Brexit thing would mean. The only words on there about what Brexit would mean were the option, leave the European Union. 4 words. There was no plan. There wasn't any manifesto put out by the people who were in favour of leave. They couldn't even agree amongst themselves. Some said we were coming out of the customs union. Boris said we were staying in. Boris said that we were staying in the single market. Daniel Hannan said nobody is questioning our position in the single market. Boris was in favour still of freedom of movement. He said he was the most liberal person in the world on immigration. But Farage wants no immigrants to come in at all. Well, actually, sometimes he wants some of them. It depends what day of the week it is. But he wanted big changes to freedom of movement. We were told, do you remember the easiest trade deals in history? Do you remember those? Do you remember they were all going to be signed a minute after we left the European Union, which was supposed to be last Friday? Well, how many of those has Liam Fox got? None. No trade deals at all with new countries, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, China, any of those. He's only got 4 trade continuity agreements. Those are the ones that simply roll over our existing trade. That's 4 out of 53. And of course, because we don't have a deal with the EU, we don't have one covering the 27 countries with which we do most trade, being our neighbouring ones. And those 4, of course, they're the ones that have agreed that they aren't going to reopen these trade deals, because in any negotiation you do, mostly. So they're very small countries. The one I noticed recently, which actually apparently Liam Fox was signing this thing in Lancaster House with cameras and all that, was with the Faroe Islands. Now, who knows where the Faroe Islands are? 2, 3, 4. Actually, this is Islington, so you're a marker. I've never had so many hands go up. I'm afraid, can I confess, I had to get the atlas out to try and find out where the Faroe Islands were. But the key fact about the Faroe Islands is their population is 50,000, half the population of the Isle of Wight. So our trade with France, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, all of that, that's all going to go. But don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, we have the Faroe Islands, where we are going to be able to export all of this New Zealand lamb, all of those cars which have got no markets to go from the West Midlands. They are all going to go to the Faroe Islands. Never is there going to be an island that has done so much trade as the Faroe Islands. The thing is a total nonsense. Now, being English, we make jokes about these things. I have so many Brexit jokes I could tell you. I could keep going just with the jokes that I've had. And I have to have jokes because I spend longer in TV and radio studios with my good friends Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson than with members of my own family at the moment. So you have to try and make light of it. And I have my latest joke. Can I tell you my latest joke? My latest joke is my Liam Fox joke. Because do you remember that the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, and by the way, I think he's paying a complete blinder on this. He is wonderful. He keeps saying, it doesn't matter how long it takes you to sort yourselves out, we'll give you the time and all that. He's absolutely wonderful. Do you remember he said that there was a special place in hell reserved for the Brexiters? Now, I'm a member of the Church of England, so I don't believe in hell. Actually, I don't necessarily believe in anything. It's just the reason why the Church of England is so successful. I'm not quite sure this is United Reformed, is it? Sorry? Is this Church of England? Catholic? Catholic. Oh dear, they do believe in hell. Sorry, this is quite serious. I need to tread very, very carefully here. They do believe in hell. But if hell does exist, and I see my good friend Bill Keegan, who's a distinguished columnist in The Observer, he's a lapsed Catholic. And so I think he believes in purgatory, but not in hell. Is that correct? You half believe. No, he doesn't believe in any. However, if hell does exist, I know who the first 4 people in it should be. Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage, and Liam Fox. They definitely should be. Indeed, I want a special hell reserved for them. And indeed, there is precedent for this because we're English, so we need precedents for everything. Dante's Inferno, I think, has 9 circles, doesn't it, of hell? And there's the most intense, well, that's the one where those 4 should all go. However, when I said this in one of my debates recently, somebody very astute phoned in and said, no, you're wrong, they said. You're wrong about Liam Fox being in hell. He likes hell. And I said, what do you mean he likes hell? He's paid several visits to it. I said, what do you mean he's paid visits to hell? He's not that mad. He said, no, he's gone there several times. He's trying to negotiate a trade deal with it. Because there's nowhere else in the world that's going to negotiate one with him. And apparently it's very large and has huge spending power. So it might be able to substitute for Ireland and Germany. So there is some hope left yet. But the truth is, this is one catalogue of lies that we've been told. And you see it now, because the situation we're now in, which makes it really clear, is that the Brexiters... Because the Brexiters, so my other joke, which I like very much, is if I was given £1 for every version of Brexit that's out there, I would have £17.4 million, which is literally true. The Brexiters, being the ones who forced all this on us 3 years ago, who now claim to be the pure Brexiters as against these marriage of convenience Brexiters, have decided they don't like anything in Theresa May's deal. They don't like the amount of money she's paying, the 39 billion that she's agreed. They don't like the Irish border, the backstop, because they think that is the EU coming in the back door. They don't like the fact that we're going to be closely aligned with the customs union. They say that we could have this thing called WTO Brexit or clean Brexit and don't need any of that. So what you've had, which always happens in revolutions, is that the revolution is devouring its children. They've all of these Brexiters have turned on Theresa May and the sellout merchants, as they call them, and are defining themselves against it. Which is why Nigel Farage said to me in a studio, he said to me that he would rather stay in the European Union than agree to Theresa May's deal. So I said, that's great. We're now going to be campaigning side by side in the referendum. We both want to stop this deal. Except, of course, that what they want to do is to sabotage Theresa May, complete the reverse takeover of the Conservative Party, which is what was going on in the Beaconsfield Conservative Association a week and a half ago and all that, and then drag towards some much harder version of Brexit, except, of course, they hope it will never actually happen. They just want to say that they want it, and it will never happen. But when you probe this, you realise the depths of the duplicity. So let's just take this issue, just because there are so many issues one could take, but let's just take this issue of what we would pay the EU, which is a pretty fundamental thing, because do you remember, and it goes to the heart of Brexit, because do you remember the bus 3 years ago? 350 million a week for the NHS. I don't know if the bus made it to Islington. Probably it got held up by the works on Highbury. It probably tried and couldn't get this far. But that was at the heart of the Brexit proposition in the referendum, and the polling shows it was one of the things that was most influential in persuading people to vote for Brexit, because it gave teeth to this slogan, take back control, because control is about money, and we could get the money back and we'd be fine. Well, we now know that that's a lie. The 350 million, because Theresa May has agreed, indeed it was the first thing she agreed alongside the Irish backstop with the EU, she agreed that we would pay an exit fee to the EU of £39 billion. And the reason we have to pay it is we have massive pensions and other liabilities for the tens of thousands of British citizens who've worked in the EU. We're not going to leave them without pensions. Ongoing payments to farmers, half-built infrastructure projects across the country under the European Regional Development Funds, and. So it's a big bill. And if we didn't pay it, we'd be in the international courts because we wouldn't be paying our debts and so on. And we're Brits, so we do pay our debts. But this is a problem for the Brexiters, because they said we were going to get 350 million a week back, and the Prime Minister's agreed that we're going to have to give them 39 billion. So what do they say when they're going for it? They say we wouldn't give them all that money. And this is a betrayal. And it is possible to have this clean Brexit that doesn't involve giving those Europeans, which is how Farage always refers to them, as those Europeans any of the money. So I've kept asking him when I'm in his LBC studio, well, Nigel, how much would you give them then? I mean, imagine, because I want you to really suspend disbelief at the moment, or welcome to the horror show. Imagine that Nigel Farage is Prime Minister in the government with Liam Fox as Chancellor, with Jacob Rees-Mogg as Home Secretary, with Boris as Foreign Secretary, because he did such a brilliant job last time. Imagine this government. And imagine it actually has to negotiate the hard Brexit, which they're saying that they would actually do. The first thing they'd have to do is to agree the financial settlement with the EU. So I keep asking, how much would you give them? Because he kept saying less than 39 billion. I said, how much less? 10 billion? 20 billion? 30 billion? Game of bingo. And what would it buy and not getting at the moment and so on. And this was the 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was on the programme, he ducked, as he always did. But then somebody phoned in, because these people phoning in, they're often very canny. If they can get past the switchboard, because normally if they're going to be critical of Nigel, they're sort of, they don't get past the switchboard filter. But this guy did. And he said, Mr. Farage, he said, answer Lord Adonis's question. How much would you pay the Europeans? It's not enough for you to say less. What is the figure? And on the rebound being slightly thrown, Nigel said, well, I'll tell you what the figure is. It's a nice round number. He said, 0. We'll pay them nothing, those Europeans, nothing. So I said, Nigel, that is brilliant. At long last, we've got an answer to the question. We now know. I want to stay in the European Union, which is the best deal we could possibly get. We get all these huge advantages. All of our trade is underpinned. We have regional developments. We actually have a plan for the poorer parts of Europe, which means they're going to be much less prey to Putin and all the populists and all that. I'm all in favour of that. The Prime Minister wants to give 39 billion. You want to give nothing. I said, but Nigel, you can't give precisely nothing. He said, what do you mean? I said, you can't do nothing, Nigel, because there's this little matter of your pension. He has a £73,000 a year pension he's going to get, paid for from the exit deal, because he's been a member of the European Parliament for 20 years. So I said, I love this bit, because this is the way of dealing with these people, is just to go for the facts. I said, Nigel, you could donate your pension to the NHS, because we have this problem, this black hole of 350 million a week. Something's got to go in it, and your pension would at least be a start. So I said, Nigel, are you volunteering to donate your pension to the NHS? Silence. It's the only time I've ever silenced him. So I said, well, I assume, therefore, we have got to at least have an exit deal that pays for your pension. I said, Nigel, I will make it my personal responsibility to negotiate your pension with the European Union. So we need to, I said, at this point he was getting visibly agitated. I said, so we need to work out how long you intend to live. I said, because actuaries, this is what they do as a profession. So I said, you're coming up, he's my age, you're 56, so you could be retiring in 4 or 5 years' time. I said, so we've got to, and you want to go to the House of Lords, and that adds 15 years to life. You could be around for another 40, 45 years. We have to multiply that by £73,000. And then I said, Nigel, we need to double it. He said, what do you mean double it? So we've got to double it, because you keep telling us this European Union is a bureaucratic, wasteful, and slothful organisation, so they're going to impose a service fee, and that's going to at least double it. So I reckon, Nigel, it's going to come to at least £10 million. I will make it my personal responsibility to negotiate an exit deal, which is £10 million. So it doesn't matter that you're not going to pay anybody else's pension. The farmers are all going to go bankrupt. We're going to have half-built infrastructure projects. We will at least have Nigel Farage's pension secured. And I said, and there's another reason why we've got to do this, Nigel. And he said, what's that? And I said, because you keep telling us that we have this, you want to roll back the state, and it's all, because it's basically a Thatcherite. That's what this whole Brexit thing is, by the way. It's extreme Thatcherism. That's what it's been about from the beginning. I said, you keep telling us that we need to dismantle all of this bloated state that's being imposed on us from Brussels. I said, we can't have you being a burden on the state in your old age. So you've got to see that your pension is secure. And I said, and there's another reason too. I said, Nigel, I said, that it's your kids. Now, herein lies another very important story, which goes to the heart of Brexit too. Because a year ago, Farage was spotted in the German embassy, the consular division, filling out citizenship forms. And one of my spies, because as you know, I'm one of these Remain traitors, so I have spies everywhere, particularly in European embassies. One of my spies sent me, they'd taken surreptitiously these photos, rather like the Beaconsfield Conservative Association, of Farage in the German embassy. And when I was next on his show, I threatened to shop him. I said, Nigel, unless you tell me why you were in the German embassy, these photos, they're going straight to the Daily Mail. I said, because you're consorting with the Queen's enemies. I mean, goodness knows what 4 hours in the German embassy. I mean, goodness knows what state secrets you could have passed them in that time. So you need to tell us why you were there. I said, because I heard this rumour, I said, Nigel, that you were applying for German citizenship. I said, because this is the rumour that was doing the rounds, which then led to my next joke, which is that I would exchange my seat in the House of Lords for your German citizenship on the grounds that a German passport is a great deal more valuable for the next 30 or 40 years than being a member of the House of Lords. Anyway, he ducked, so I knew I was onto something, and then he ducked again in the next one. And then when in the next one I began my riff, Nigel, I want to exchange my seat in the House of Lords for your German passport. He cut me short and said, Andrew, I wish you'd stop spreading these lies. I do not have a German passport. So I said, that's great, Nigel. Why were you in the German embassy then? And then on the rebound, without properly reflecting, he said, because I was filling out passport forms for my kids. Aha, I thought. Aha, I now understand. Because his wife is German. And he has 2 children in their 20s. Indeed, I know he has 2 children in their 20s, because when I was schools minister, I did the prize giving at Dulwich College, that down-market comprehensive, because Nigel isn't a member of the metropolitan elite, of course. And he was there, and Nigel was there in his Dulwich Old Boys tie and blazer in the front row, because I was giving a prize to his son. So I know exactly where the Farages come from and how old his children are. Now, I don't bring my children into politics, and I don't expect other people to either, but he had raised it himself. So I said, Nigel, it is wonderful that your children have German passports. I said, it's very interesting they want to have German passports now. Does it by any chance have anything to do with Brexit? Why suddenly these passports have become so valuable? But I said, I have a proposition for you. I said, it is great they have German passports. I know tens of millions of other young Brits who would love to have German passports. Will you adopt them all? Because if you adopted them all, then they could all have German passports. Then this big problem we've got with Brexit of people losing their European citizenship, that would be finished. We'd have none of this anymore. And indeed, there's this fantastic organisation called Our Future, Our Choice, which is the young mobilising the young, which, by the way, is how we're going to win the referendum. The young are going to mobilise the young big time. They are all coming out and voting big time. And they are, these youngsters, they're brilliant at stunts. And after I'd had this confrontation with Farage in his studio, they all turned up outside his house the following morning with adoption forms, asking him to adopt them. The problem is, I'm afraid he is quite good. He is quite good, this Farage. He took them down to the pub, and after a few pints, they left the adoption forms in the pub, so he didn't actually get this thing there. But anyway, this one has run and run, which then led to my next confrontation with Farage in the studio. When I asked him how many he'd adopted, I said, I know that there are tens of millions who want. How many of you actually adopted Farage? I said, Nigel, once you've done all the kids in their 20s, I said, I've got a special request for you. What is the maximum age at which you will adopt people so they can get German citizenship? Because I met a 93-year-old yesterday, and they're very keen to be adopted by you, because they too want a German passport. So coming back to the money thing, I said to Nigel, well, we've got to negotiate at least your pension. I said, because we don't want you a burden on us, and we now know that your kids are going to be living in Germany when you retire, so there's going to be nobody here to look after you at all. Well, at that point, the conversation degenerated completely. But can you see the serious point underlying all this? It was a lie to say that there was 350 million a week that we would get as a result of leaving the EU. We know it's a lie, because 3 years on, Theresa May has negotiated the exit deal, which is 39 billion. And to assert that you could do it for less or nothing is a lie. It was a lie to say that we could stay in the customs union, have all the economic benefits of being in the European Union while leaving it. In life, you cannot leave the club and keep the benefits. That never happens. And it was a lie to pretend otherwise. It was a lie to say that replacing our membership of the European Union and the customs union and the single market would be the easiest trade deal in history. That's what Liam Fox said. That was a lie. It was a lie to say that there would be dozens of other trade agreements, including with Trump. Do you remember we were going to have the Trump one, which turned out to be the chlorinated chicken and the NHS being open to foreign bids and all of that? That was a lie. And to my mind, the most potent lie of all, because this poses an immediate threat to the security of our country. It was a lie to say that you can have the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland with different immigration policies and different customs and trade regimes and not have a hard border, when the best thing, I would submit to you, that has happened in this country in the last 30 years is peace in Northern Ireland, an end of terrorism, the decommissioning of weapons, all of which was made possible by the Good Friday Agreement, at the heart of which is having a completely open border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is only possible because the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are both in the European Union, which means there are no trade barriers, customs duties, or immigration controls. And this is where you get Orwellian, because, of course, that is the reason why the Prime Minister negotiated the backstop. Let's be clear. She freely agreed the backstop. It was not forced on her by the European Union. She freely agreed it. We know why she agreed it. She said so pretty much in public, because the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, who is not some Remain fanatic, he is one of a dedicated public servant, he said, the single biggest threat to peace in Ireland is Brexit, because if you have hard border arrangements in Ireland, they will be run by the paramilitaries, who have always run it. Remember, that's what happened in the 60s and 70s. They were running smuggling across the border then. And that smuggling then becomes an agent of control, and also a way of raising money, which for the paramilitaries, we all know where that will lead. And this is not an idle threat. Till 20 years ago, we had terrorism. We still have serious paramilitary groups, including bombs going off in Derry, Londonderry 2 weeks ago, partly because there isn't a devolved government in Northern Ireland. And part of the reason why there isn't a devolved government is because the government, our government, won't put pressure on the DUP to come to a deal with Sinn Féin. Why won't it do that? Because it depends upon their votes in the House of Commons. You need to understand how all of these things interrelate. But when her deal was rejected because the ERG and Jacob wouldn't have the Northern Ireland backstop because they regarded that as the EU coming in by the back door, what did the Prime Minister say? Amazingly, she said that she would renegotiate it, which was an amazing statement because she had agreed it herself and she had told the House of Commons that there was no alternative to it when she was trying to get them, the ERG, to vote for it first time. And there isn't any alternative to it. You can't have border controls that aren't border controls. This idea it can all be done in the cloud and electronically is total and utter farce. There is no border in the world which operates in the cloud. You know, we were then told, because this whole Brexit thing is one political Ponzi scheme. You make one set of lies. When they catch up with you, you make even bigger lies. And then by the time people catch up with you, and it takes the BBC about 5 years to catch up with each lie, then you get onto the third set of lies. So when they started saying, because I was in TV and radio studios with Farage when he said, oh, it's all straightforward, just go and look at what happens between Norway and Sweden and Switzerland and France. Well, I do my job, so I did go to look at what happens. Well, the border between Norway and Sweden closes at 10 o'clock at night. There isn't much traffic that goes across it, but it does have quite long queues. The Swiss-French border often has trucks queuing for an hour to get across. And random searches are done of individuals. And if you have anything more than, I think it's a chicken in terms of value, you take across, you're supposed to pay customs duties and fill out a customs form for it. It is a lie to say it could be done. So what does the Prime Minister do when faced with this situation? What does she do? She says, we will seek, and this is the basis on which we're supposed to be leaving the European Union at the moment, we will seek to negotiate alternative arrangements. Now, the alternative arrangements, she has to use the phrase alternative arrangements because they don't exist. There are no alternative arrangements. So when she was asked in the House of Commons, what are these alternative arrangements? I mean, this becomes Orwellian at this point. She said, we have set up an alternative arrangements working group whose job will be to determine the alternative arrangements. So the fact that no one has done it in the world, don't worry about that. The alternative arrangements working group will come up with the alternative to border controls, tariffs, and customs controls and all of that at some point in the future. It is a total farce. But to understand constantly, because whilst making jokes of it, it's deadly serious, I've kept asking Jacob when I'm in studios with him, because he makes a big thing of this Irish thing, what would you do? You don't want to stay in the European Union. You don't like her backstop. So what would you do? We've got this real problem about the fact that we've got this border in Ireland. How are you going to see there's no border? And I said, these alternative arrangements don't work. There aren't any. So what would you do? And do you know what he said in the last confrontation I had with him again when he was under pressure because people kept asking him and he shouldn't dodge the question? He said that what should happen? He said, the way, he said, Lord Adonis in his drawl, that you can avoid this mythical hard border of yours, he said, is for Ireland to leave the European Union too. Now, there is a Rees-Mogg logic. Do you follow the logic? Let me just take you through the logic. If at the same time as we leave the European Union, because remember we both came into the European Union together, partly to see that we didn't have border controls unnecessarily in the early 70s, if the Republic of Ireland leaves at the same time as we leave, and the Dáil and the Irish government agree in advance, they sign on the dotted line, this blank check, that they will adopt whatever our tariff, customs, immigration rules are, going out into the future. It is true, if they did all of those things, that there wouldn't need to be a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. There would still be a massive problem, by the way, between the Republic of Ireland and the rest of Europe, so it wouldn't be sensible for them to do it, but it does at least deal with this issue. But have you spotted the problem? There is a reason why this country is called the Republic of Ireland. Jacob's ancestors spent 5 years trying to tell them what to do in a colonial and dictatorial arrangement. It did not work. That is the reason why we had civil war in Ireland and had to have the Republic of Ireland. It is not just mind-boggling, but it is deeply irresponsible and, to my mind, semi-criminal to say that the way that you deal with this issue is to presuppose that the government and Parliament of Ireland will, for the next 50 and 100 years, do precisely what we tell them. It is totally irresponsible. Now, the point about it is all of these are reasons also why we need to have a referendum. Because we did not know, the British people were not told, they could not be told because there had been no deal, what Brexit would mean 3 years ago. Now that we know, now that we can see that this is the biggest set of decisions we're going to take as a country, now that we can see what the impact is going to be on our families, our communities, now that we are genuinely worried about it and think that this is a big deal, which is what people think, we wouldn't all be here on a Sunday afternoon if that weren't the case. What is the right thing to do? It is very simple. Referendum, option to remain, and if there's a majority for it, revoke and end this whole nightmare. That's what we should do. And then, because I've been speaking for too long. I'm afraid I always tend to speak longer in churches because for some reason I think I'm giving a sermon, and I know these Catholic homilies, they go on forever, I know. But let me just bring my remarks to a close. I want to get questions and comments. Let's get a discussion going. When we get this referendum, which I think we'll probably get once we've got the long extension, and remember the Sherlock Holmes book, I think it's A Study in Scarlet. Once all the impossible options have been eliminated, Sherlock, you're just left with the improbable, which must be the truth, which is how we're going to get the referendum once the impossible options are no deal, her deal times 2, Canada, Norway, once all this lot have been eliminated, we will just be left with what is a credible democratic way of bringing an end to this whole thing, which will be a referendum. So we all get there ultimately. When we get there, we have the referendum, we're pounding the streets, hand in hand with Jeremy and Emily, because, of course, they'll be there too, because Labour will have voted for it. What are the 4 big arguments that we will use as to why, on mature reflection, we shouldn't go ahead with this Brexit thing? Let me just run through them. I've said quite a lot about them in a tangential way so far, but they come together very clearly. Firstly, trade, jobs, and the economy. It is now clear that any form of Brexit trashes our economy. The only question is how much it trashes it. You cannot have your cake and eat it. You cannot leave the club and keep the benefits. Because I have a really distinguished economist in the back row and maybe others, when I studied economics for 1 term at university, I remember the first rule of trade economics. Trade halves as distance doubles. That is why we do more trade with the Republic of Ireland than with China. Not because the Republic of Ireland is larger than China, but because it's closer, because we have a 250-mile border with it, with 208 crossing points. So, of course, we do huge amounts of trade with it. So what is the right thing to do? It is not to trash our trade with our 27 nearest neighbours, which accounts for half our trade, on the basis of agreements which have been painstakingly negotiated over the course of half a century and on which millions of jobs and livelihoods depend. The right thing to do is not to Brexit and to stay in the EU. Second reason why, I don't need to say more about Ireland. The only way to ensure you do not have a harder border, and possibly a very hard border in Ireland, is not to Brexit, to stay in the European Union. Third reason why we should stay in is the whole future of our young people. And they're getting wise to this, which is the reason why the young are now so overwhelmingly against Brexit. Now, of course, all of us are affected by Brexit, but the young particularly, because they're starting out in their careers, they're looking at what they might do job-wise, where they might live, who they might forge relationships with, and all of that. Because we have this thing called European Union citizenship, they have an absolute right, not subject to any bureaucrats telling them what to do, not subject to filling out any forms at all, an absolute right to live, love, work, settle, do what they like that's lawful across 28 countries. When we leave the European Union, that 28 will be reduced to 1. We don't know how much it's going to be reduced. Are we going to have an ESTA-type system or full-blown visas? Are our European friends going to allow us to buy property in their countries or not? You can go down the list, but we know that the terms will be worse, and they will possibly be a great deal worse. They don't want this, and they're right. And that's why, not just meetings like this I'm doing, but when I do meetings in sixth forms, and by the way, 16 and 17-year-olds, they're desperate to have the vote, and I think they should have the vote in this referendum too, because their future is hugely at stake. They want the vote, they want to vote against it, and when I did something recently with a group of students who was going through all the arguments, one of them said, we now get it. What you're saying to us is that this Brexit thing means that we're going to be shut up on a small island with Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. And that is true. That is what is going to happen. We are going to be shut up on that small island. We don't want it. They certainly don't want it for the rest of their lives. So what is the right thing to do for the next generation? It's not different forms of Brexit, some being better than the others. It's no Brexit is the best, and just put a stop to it. But the fourth and final reason why we should campaign against Brexit, we didn't hear much about 3 years ago, but to my mind is the most powerful and compelling reason of all. The European Union is the best peace project in the entire history of Europe. Indeed. I've written this book with another distinguished Observer columnist called Saving Britain, and I'm signing copies afterwards. All of the proceeds go to great European causes. The rare copies are the unsigned ones. If you want the common ones, which are signed, they're always afterwards. But a chapter of this, we go through the history of the EU and its roots. And the crucial thing to understand about the EU is why it was founded in the 1940s and 50s wasn't actually immediately about trade and markets. They were the means to the end. The objective, which is the reason why the founding members, the core founding members, were France and Germany, the objective was peace. Because we have had the only 70 years, consecutive years, of peace in Europe that Europe has ever had. If you go right back to the Romans, there has been no other period of 70 years when there's been peace. It has a lot to do with the fact that the European Union is a club of democracies where countries agree to respect each other's borders. It's the other side of the coin from NATO, which is collective security. All of these things go together. And the reason why it's so poignant is the most bloody 70 years, because some historians foolishly believe that things have civilized over time, and that we were barbarians 2,000 years ago. It's got steadily better until I think the apogee of civilization has been reached in Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson and people of this kind. That isn't, in fact, how history works. It goes up and down, is the truth, because you're dealing with human nature, the human condition, and all of that. The most peaceful 70 years in European history have been the last 70 years. The most bloody and the most disruptive and the most devastating were the 70 years before that, when we had two wars that became world wars, which devastated the entire continent of Europe in the space of only 40 years. Indeed, I was reading a book about the history of slavery recently, and just to bring home to how serious this is. In the entire history of Europe, the year when there were most slaves, human slaves in Europe, was 1943. In the middle of the Second World War, when most of Europe was enslaved by the Nazi tyranny, literally enslaved. This idea that history is great progress and all of that, the reason we've had 70 years of peace is because we have, thank God, had 70 years of wise statecraft and good policies, and we have worked together and we have created common institutions. It has not happened by chance. And if you think it might happen by chance and spontaneously, look at what's happened in our lifetimes in the Balkans, where the most bloody civil war in Europe happened on our fringes in the Balkans. Why? Because it wasn't part of the European Union then. Crucially important to understand that. Now, we have most of the Balkans which have come in, and we've managed to stabilise the situations. It's hugely important. Meanwhile, we have Putin, who's already invaded one European country, Ukraine, and occupied half of it. He has massive troops on the borders of 3 other European states, the Baltic states. This is a real dangerous situation. What is the right thing for us to do? To stay in the European Union or to leave it? In this context, it's a total no-brainer. And that brings me finally to the founding treaties, because the founding treaty of the European Union, as we now know, was the Treaty of Paris of 1951, which was the treaty that brought together France, Germany, the Benelux countries, and Italy. We should have joined it. It's my view that actually Churchill might well have joined it if he'd been Prime Minister at the time, because it followed his Zurich speech of 1946, when Churchill called for a kind of United States of Europe, and he said, crucially, we must form a kind of United States of Europe. We, including we Brits, not they, must form one. It was very clear to me how his thinking was developing. But in a huge mistake of policy, which is, I think, largely responsible for all of the problems we've had in our relationship with Europe since we stood up outside the original construction of the European institutions, and we never became fully part of them afterwards. But if you read the Treaty of Paris, which set up what was called then the Iron and the coal and steel community, which then became the common market, which became the single market, which became the European Union that we know today. The opening preamble, the statement of objectives, the opening part of this treaty, don't talk about coal and steel. They don't talk about the economy at all. They talk about war, peace, civilization, and bloodshed. And I just want, in conclusion, to read out to you the first few paragraphs of the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1951, 6 years after the end of the Holocaust and this great European conflict, to bring home why all this is so vitally important to us and to our security. The President of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Prince Royal of Belgium, the President of the French Republic, the President of the Italian Republic, the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, the Queen of the Netherlands. Considering that world peace can be safeguarded only by creative efforts commensurate with the dangers that threaten it, convinced that the contribution which an organised and vital Europe can make to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations, resolved, and this bit is amazing for an international treaty, resolved to substitute for age-old rivalries the merging of their essential interests to create, by establishing an economic community, the basis for a broader and deeper community amongst peoples long divided by bloody conflicts, have decided to create a European coal and steel community. That's the reason why the European Union was founded 70 years ago. It's the reason why it's every bit as relevant today. It's the reason why we should want to stay. It's the reason why we need a referendum before we commit this massive act of national and European self-harm. And it's the reason why we won't rest until we've succeeded. Thanks very much.